Millhaven wasn't the kind of town where people locked their doors at night. It was a place where neighbors greeted each other by name, where children played freely in tree-lined streets, and where crime was something that happened somewhere else. Places like the big cities or distant counties. The thought of danger felt almost foreign here, a mere echo in the background of everyday life. In Millhaven, people believed they were safe. They believed they were untouched by the horrors of the world beyond their borders. But that fragile sense of security shattered on the night of October 12, 2019. At exactly 3:42 a.m., the stillness of the night was torn apart by the piercing shriek of a 911 call. A woman's voice, trembling with fear, barely above a whisper. "There's blood everywhere," she gasped, her voice barely coherent. "I think he's dead. I don't know what happened." The dispatcher, calm but urgent, tried to steady her. "Ma'am, please stay with me. Can you tell me what's going on?" But the woman's voice faltered, breaking under the weight of panic. A sharp intake of breath. Then the line went dead. In the silence that followed, Millhaven seemed to hold its breath. Within moments, the sleepy town was alive with the pulse of red and blue sirens. Officers rushed through the dark streets, their boots crunching over the fallen autumn leaves, their breath visible in the chill night air. The glow of their flashing lights reflected off the polished surfaces of the few remaining houses still tucked behind their windows, as though even the town itself had been shaken from its slumber. The house on Elmwood Drive stood in quiet resignation, its front door ajar, untouched by the usual signs of a break-in. The light inside flickered faintly, casting long shadows over the polished hardwood floors. The air smelled heavy, like damp earth, blood, and something else, something more insidious. Detective James Holloway, one of the first officers on the scene, stepped inside. The house was eerily still, the sort of stillness that made his skin crawl. The blood was everywhere. Christopher Parker, a beloved local teacher, lay sprawled on the living room floor, his body still in the exact position where death had come for him. His throat had been slit with surgical precision. An act so brutal, yet so clean, it sent a cold chill through Holloway's spine. His eyes were wide open, locked in a frozen stare that spoke of unspeakable horror. Blood pooled beneath him, a dark crimson stain spreading out across the floor, turning the once warm wood into something unrecognizable. But there was something more, something that made Holloway's stomach twist. On the mirror above the fireplace, written in blood, were 4 words. "I know what you did." A breathless silence hung in the room as the words seemed to taunt the officers, their meaning unmistakable. There was no struggle here, no sign of a violent fight, no broken windows or forced doors. Whoever had done this hadn't needed to break in. Christopher had let them in. The realization struck Holloway like a hammer to the chest. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was personal. As Holloway stepped back, taking in the horrific scene, his mind raced. Who would do this? Who would want Christopher Parker dead? And why would they leave such a chilling message? Outside, the town was beginning to stir. By the time the sun's first light began to stretch over Millhaven's peaceful streets, the sirens and flashing lights had faded, but the weight of what had happened lingered. The tranquil, safe town, the one where the biggest worry used to be forgotten garbage cans or misplaced yard tools, had become a place of fear. Fear that something terrible had happened, something that would change everything. And worse, no one had any answers. As Holloway looked down at the lifeless body of the man who had once been the heart of the town, a devoted teacher, a trusted neighbor, a loving husband, he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. He could already hear the whispers stirring, traveling from one house to the next, creeping into the lives of everyone who had once believed that Millhaven was safe from such horrors. By sunrise, the sense of innocence was gone. Millhaven had been irreparably changed. It had become a town haunted by whispers. Whispers of guilt, whispers of lies, and whispers of the truth that was still buried, waiting to be uncovered. And somewhere, hidden in the dark corners of the town, the killer was watching. Christopher Parker was the kind of man who inspired trust without effort. A dedicated teacher at Millhaven High, a loving husband to his wife Samantha, and a friend to anyone who needed one. He was the pillar of the small community. His smile was warm, his presence reassuring, and his life, at least on the surface, was perfect. To the residents of Millhaven, Christopher was the embodiment of everything good in their world. He was, in many ways, the face of their town. But the truth, as always, was more complicated than it appeared. It wasn't until after his death that the layers began to peel away, revealing the cracks in his seemingly perfect life. The first crack appeared when Samantha Parker, Christopher's wife, was brought into the station for questioning. She had been the one to make the frantic 911 call, the one to discover the grisly scene in their living room. Now, days later, she sat across from Detective James Holloway in the sterile interrogation room, her eyes swollen with tears and her hands trembling as they clutched a lukewarm cup of coffee. She hadn't slept since the night Christopher was killed. They had been happy, she said, or at least she had thought they were. But there was an undeniable emptiness in her words, a crack in the illusion she had so carefully built around herself. "We were happy," Samantha whispered, her voice barely above a murmur. "Or at least, I thought we were." Detective Holloway leaned forward, his eyes never leaving her face. He had seen this reaction too many times. Grief, guilt, confusion, intertwined in a way that made it difficult to discern truth from lie. But there was something about her, a rawness that tugged at him. Was it the shock of the moment, or was there something more? "Mrs. Parker," Holloway began gently, "when was the last time you saw your husband alive?" Samantha flinched, her eyes flickering to the mirror that separated the interrogation room from the small observation booth where other officers stood watching. It was a reflex, Holloway knew, a subconscious way to check if someone else was listening. "Around 8, she said slowly. "Maybe a little later. I left for my sister's. I didn't think anything was wrong." "And was Christopher expecting anyone that night?" Holloway pressed. "Did he seem off? Worried?" Samantha's gaze faltered, her eyes darting to the ground. "He had been getting letters," she said quietly. "Anonymous ones. I told him to go to the police, but he refused. Said it was nothing. But he wasn't sleeping well. He was scared." "What kind of letters?" Holloway asked, his pen poised above his notepad. Samantha swallowed hard, her throat working as though the words were lodged there, unwilling to come out. "Threats," she said at last, her voice almost breaking. "Warnings. Someone knew something about him, and they wanted him to pay." The words lingered in the air, heavy and ominous. Holloway's mind churned with possibilities. Threats, hidden fears, letters no one else had seen. Was this a case of blackmail? A domestic dispute turned deadly? "I don't have any of the letters," Samantha continued, her hands curling tightly around her coffee cup. "He kept them hidden, wouldn't let me see them, but I know they scared him. I could see it in his eyes." Holloway scribbled notes in his book. If Christopher had been hiding something, then this was no longer just a random act of violence. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong or a spur-of-the-moment crime. It was personal. The killer hadn't just chosen Christopher at random. They had known him. They had wanted him dead. The deeper Holloway dug into Christopher's life, the more the man's perfect image started to crumble. Christopher Parker had been a respected teacher, but that didn't explain why someone would want to kill him. There had to be something more. The first real lead came from an unlikely source, Lena Caldwell. A former student of Christopher's, Lena was now a college sophomore, a young woman with a past tied to the murdered teacher. When detectives interviewed her, they learned that just weeks before the murder, she had been seen arguing with Christopher in the parking lot outside Millhaven High. The argument had been heated, a according to witnesses, with Lena's voice sharp and accusatory, while Christopher seemed to be pleading with her. Lena had denied any connection to the murder when questioned, but Holloway wasn't convinced. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that betrayed her calm demeanor. "We need to talk about what you and Christopher fought about," Holloway said, his voice firm as he slid a photo of the crime scene across the table. Lena recoiled, her face draining of color as she stared at the image. I told you, it was nothing." "Lena," Holloway pressed, his voice softer now, "Christopher was murdered just weeks after your argument. That's not a coincidence. We need the truth." She exhaled sharply, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "It wasn't just me. There were others. He had secrets." "Secrets?" Holloway asked, leaning in. "What kind of secrets?" Lena's voice dropped to a near whisper. "There was someone else, someone close to him, and they were angry." The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they weren't yet clear enough to reveal the full picture. Who had Christopher been hiding? What had he done that had caused such anger and resentment? And why had the killer decided to end his life? As the investigation deepened, another name emerged: Mark Holloway, Christopher's best friend. The two had been inseparable for years, but for reasons unknown, Mark had suddenly severed all contact with Christopher about a month before the murder. This break in their friendship raised more questions than it answered. When detectives approached Mark, his reaction was telling. He refused to speak at first, his hands trembling as he avoided their gaze, as though every word he spoke would expose a truth he was desperate to hide. "Mark," Detective Holloway said, his voice measured but urgent, "if you know something, you need to tell us." After a long pause, Mark finally met his gaze, his eyes clouded with guilt and fear. "He wasn't who you think he was. Explain," Holloway urged. Mark ran a hand through his hair, his voice cracking. "Christopher, he betrayed people. He made promises he couldn't keep, and someone made him pay for it." Those words echoed in Holloway's mind long after Mark had left the room. Betrayal, promises broken. It was clear now that there were dark corners of Christopher's life that no one had ever known about. He wasn't the saint everyone had believed him to be, and someone, somewhere, had been waiting for the perfect moment to expose him and punish him for it. The breakthrough came when detectives discovered a locked drawer in Christopher's study, containing a stack of letters. They were all handwritten, and they all carried the same chilling message. "I know what you did." Some of the letters were old, dating back months, while others were recent. The most recent letter, dated October 11th, 2019, the night before Christopher's murder, was particularly chilling. It was clear now that Christopher had known his time was running out. He had hidden the letters, tried to ignore the warnings, but he had known someone was coming for him. And instead of confessing or confronting his past, he had buried it. He had hoped to bury the truth, his secrets, but someone else had decided he didn't deserve that luxury. The mystery was no longer about who had the motive. Now, it was about which of Christopher's secrets had finally caught up with him, and who was determined to make sure they were never uncovered. The town of Millhaven had already begun to change. Whispers had begun to swirl, people talking in hushed voices, wondering who had killed Christopher Parker and why. But Holloway knew the truth was far darker than anyone had imagined, and it was only just beginning to come to light. The morning after the discovery of the letters, Detective Holloway sat in his office, staring at the pile of evidence on his desk. The letters were haunting in their simplicity, yet they were the key to unlocking the tangled web of Christopher Parker's life. Each one, handwritten in a scrawled, jagged script, seemed to pulse with an undeniable sense of urgency. Holloway had read them over and over, the words, "I know what you did," echoing in his mind, gnawing at him with every passing minute. What had Christopher done to warrant such hatred? And why had someone gone to such lengths to conceal it? The letters weren't the only mystery. There was the question of the hidden drawer. Why had Christopher gone to such lengths to keep these messages from his wife, from the people closest to him? Was he trying to protect them from the truth? Or was there something even darker lurking in his past that he couldn't confront? Holloway's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," he called, not looking up from his notes. It was Officer Larkin, holding a thick folder in her hands. "We got a lead on that former student, Lena Caldwell," she said, her voice sharp. "She's been in contact with someone, a man named Thomas Morrow. He's a former colleague of Christopher's. They worked together at Millhaven High years ago." Holloway's interest piqued immediately. "Morrow, you say? What's his connection to the case?" Larkin flipped open the folder. "According to his records, he's been under investigation for financial fraud in the past. A few years back, he was fired for embezzling funds from a student fundraiser. But he vanished before the investigation could be completed. His last known whereabouts were in Atlanta, but there's no recent activity on his record. He just disappeared." Holloway leaned back in his chair, processing the information. "A man with a criminal past connected to Christopher. Interesting. We need to find him. Do we have a lead on his current location?" Larkin nodded. "We've traced his phone to a property just outside of Millhaven. It's a cabin on the outskirts of town. We should head out there as soon as possible." Holloway didn't hesitate. "Let's go. The sooner we find Morrow, the sooner we uncover what he knows about Christopher." The drive to the cabin was a quiet one. Holloway stared out the window as the trees blurred past, his mind racing with possibilities. What had Morrow and Christopher been involved in all those years ago? Had the scandal surrounding the fundraiser been a catalyst for something darker? And how did Lena Caldwell fit into the equation? The tension was palpable, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to align, but the full picture remained elusive. When they arrived, the cabin appeared to be abandoned, overgrown with vines and surrounded by a thicket of trees. It was clear that no one had lived there in some time. Holloway approached cautiously, his hand resting on the grip of his firearm, just in case. Larkin was already checking the perimeter, her eyes scanning every corner for any sign of life. She moved quickly, her experience in the field evident in the way she navigated the property. "I don't like this, Holloway," she said, her voice low. "Something feels off." Holloway nodded in agreement. The cabin felt like a ghost of a past long forgotten, the air thick with an eerie silence that seemed to hang in the atmosphere. The door creaked as Holloway pushed it open, the hinges protesting the intrusion. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished. Dust covered everything, and the air smelled stale, as though the place hadn't seen life in years. Yet something about the space felt lived in. A faint smell of tobacco lingered in the air, and a glass of half-empty whiskey sat on the table near the window. Larkin moved toward the back of the cabin, checking the rooms one by one. Holloway walked to the small desk in the corner and rifled through the papers scattered across it. Most of them were mundane, old receipts, outdated documents, and a few notebooks filled with illegible handwriting. But one notebook stood out. It was thick, bound in leather, and the pages were filled with cryptic entries, some of which seemed to have been written in a hurry. Holloway flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the contents. The entries mentioned Christopher's name multiple times, often in a tone of frustration and anger. It was clear that whatever relationship Morrow and Christopher had shared, it hadn't ended well. He read aloud one of the entries. "He promised me he would make it right. He said we could move on from this, but he's backed out. He can't hide from his past forever. Someone will find out the truth, and when they do, he'll pay for what he's done." The words sent a chill down Holloway's spine. Whoever had written this had been deeply invested in whatever secret Christopher had been trying to bury. But who was he referring to? And what had Christopher done that had caused such animosity? Larkin returned to the room, her face grim. "No sign of Moreau," she said. "It's like he's just disappeared." Holloway closed the notebook and shoved it into his jacket. "We need to find him, and soon. He's the key to understanding what happened between him and Christopher. Whatever their history, it's far from over." Back at the station, Holloway spent hours poring over the evidence. The notebook, the letters, and the various statements from witnesses painted a picture of a man who had been hiding his past for a long time. Christopher Parker's life was like a house built on a foundation of lies, and every secret he had buried seemed to be coming to light in one way or another. It wasn't just Lena Caldwell who had been affected by Christopher's secrets. Mark Holloway, the best friend who had severed all ties, had more to hide than he let on. His refusal to speak about the rift between him and Christopher only made Holloway more suspicious. Then there was Samantha, Christopher's wife, whose grief and guilt seemed to be eating away at her. She had known something was wrong, but had she known the extent of it? Had she been involved in keeping the secret, or was she another victim of her husband's deceit? Holloway couldn't shake the feeling that everyone around Christopher had been complicit in something. The more he uncovered, the more tangled the web became. A call interrupted his thoughts. It was Officer Larkin. "We've got a hit on Moreau. He was seen in a small town outside of Millhaven, not far from the cabin," she reported. "We think he might be hiding out there." Holloway stood, grabbing his coat and heading for the door. "Get the team together. We're not letting him slip away this time." As they drove out of town toward the remote area where Moreau was last seen, Holloway's thoughts swirled with the growing realization that the truth about Christopher Parker was far darker than he had imagined. Moreau wasn't just hiding from the law, he was hiding from something far more dangerous, and Holloway was about to find out just how deep the lies went. The small town of Ravenswood sat nestled between dense woods and rolling hills, a place where time seemed to slow down. It wasn't a place that attracted many outsiders, and that was exactly why Detective Holloway had a sinking feeling as they pulled into the town's single main street. He could feel the eyes of the few residents who walked past, watching him with an unspoken awareness that things were about to change. Holloway stepped out of the car, adjusting his jacket as he looked around. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Larkin was already out of the car, her eyes scanning the surroundings with practiced caution. "You sure this is the right place?" she asked, her voice low. "I'm sure," Holloway replied, his gaze lingering on the old buildings lining the street. "Moreau's hiding here. We need to find him before he disappears again." They approached a small, dilapidated inn at the edge of the town. Its windows were fogged with age, and the paint had long since peeled away, leaving behind the gray skeleton of a structure that seemed as though it might collapse under its own weight. Holloway had seen places like this before, places where secrets festered, where the past had a way of clinging to every rotting floorboard and cracked wall. Inside, the musty air greeted them with a wave of stale memories. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a disarming smile, greeted them as they stepped through the door. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but cautious. "We're looking for a man named Thomas Moreau," Holloway said, showing her his badge. "We believe he's been staying here." The woman's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Holloway thought he saw something more than just recognition. It was the briefest flash of fear. But then, she masked it, returning to her neutral expression. "Moreau? I haven't seen anyone by that name," she replied, her voice a bit too measured. "You sure you've got the right place?" Holloway studied her face, noting the way she shifted her weight, the slight tremor in her hand as she wiped down the counter. He wasn't buying it. "Are you sure? A man matching his description was seen near here just a few days ago," he pressed. "If you've seen him, you need to tell us." The woman hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor for a moment, before she sighed heavily and looked back up at him. "You're right. He was here. But he left hurriedly. I don't know where he went, though." Holloway wasn't about to let up. "Do you have a last name for him? Anyone he might have been with?" The woman's lips tightened. "I don't know nothing about no last names. But he was friendly with a woman who came around here now and then. Young, pretty, with dark hair. She used to sit in the corner booth when he was here." "Lena Caldwell," Larkin muttered, as if the name had been on the tip of her tongue for days. Holloway nodded, glancing at Larkin with a silent understanding. Lena had to be involved in all of this. She was the link between Moreau and Christopher Parker, and now she seemed to be the key to finding him. "Did you ever hear them talk about Christopher Parker?" Holloway asked, watching the innkeeper's every move. The woman's face tightened once more, the same flicker of fear dancing behind her eyes. I didn't hear much, but I did overhear her say once that she didn't want anyone to find out what happened. I don't know what she meant by it, but that's all I know." Holloway's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What happened?" But the woman just shook her head. "I'm sorry, detective. I don't know any more than that. I'm just trying to run my business, not get tangled in your investigation." Frustrated but determined, Holloway and Larkin exchanged a look. It was clear they weren't going to get much more out of the innkeeper, but this conversation had already given them a new lead. "Thank you for your time," Holloway said, his tone sharp. He wasn't done with her yet, but they needed to move quickly before Moreau could slip through their fingers again. The trail for Thomas Moreau and Lena Caldwell was growing colder by the minute. Holloway and Larkin spent the next few hours searching the town for any sign of the two. They questioned shopkeepers, bar owners, and locals, but no one seemed to know anything. Ravenswood, it seemed, wasn't a town that welcomed strangers. But as they sat in their car, parked at the edge of town, Holloway's mind kept returning to the innkeeper's words. "I didn't want anyone to find out what happened. What had happened? What were they all hiding?" Lena's connection to Christopher was clear now. It was her who had been receiving the letters. Lena who had been involved with Moreau, and likely involved in whatever had torn Christopher's life apart. But what had Christopher been trying to cover up, and why? As the sun began to set, casting a soft orange glow over the trees surrounding the town, Holloway's phone buzzed. It was a message from Larkin. "Got something. Local diner. Lena's been seen there." Holloway's heart skipped a beat. This was it. They were getting close. The diner was a small, cozy establishment, the kind where the smell of coffee and fresh pie filled the air. Holloway and Larkin stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling as they entered. The few patrons inside looked up for a moment, sizing them up before returning to their meals. The waitress behind the counter greeted them with a polite smile, but it faded slightly when she saw their serious expressions. "Can I help you, officers?" she asked. "We're looking for a woman named Lena Caldwell," Larkin said. "She's been seen here recently." The waitress paused, her eyes darting to the back of the diner where a woman sat in the far corner, her face partially obscured by the newspaper she was reading. Holloway's instincts told him it was Lena. He took a step toward her, but Larkin held him back with a gentle but firm hand. "Let me talk to her," Larkin said quietly, her voice low. "I'll see if she's willing to cooperate." Holloway watched as Larkin made her way over to Lena, who looked up from her newspaper with a flicker of recognition. The tension in the room thickened as Holloway waited, but he didn't need to see the conversation unfold to know that it wasn't going to be easy. Moments later, Larkin returned, her face tight. "She knows something." She admitted she knew Christopher, but she's not talking. "Not yet," Larkin reported. "She's scared. Whatever happened between her, Moreau, and Parker, it's something big, and she's afraid." Holloway clenched his jaw, his mind racing. "We'll need her to talk. It's time to put pressure on her. We have no choice." As they prepared to take their next steps, Holloway couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to come crashing down. But one thing was certain. The secrets of Christopher Parker's past were no longer his to hide. The town of Ravenswood was still. The kind of stillness that felt unnatural, as though the world had paused to catch its breath. Holloway stood outside the courthouse, staring at the stone steps where, just a few days ago, a man had been convicted of a crime he hadn't committed. Moreau's trial had been swift, almost too swift, but the truth had a way of slipping through the cracks when everyone had a secret to protect. Lena Caldwell had told her story, a confession more than an explanation, but the pieces hadn't quite fit. The final revelation had shocked even Holloway. The murder of Christopher Parker was not just about betrayal, but a tangled web of past sins, guilt, and revenge. Moreau had been manipulated, forced into a corner by a ghost from his own past, and Lena had been the unwilling accomplice. But the truth had come at a high cost. Holloway could still feel the weight of the conversation with her, the final words that hung in the air like a heavy fog. "I never wanted it to end like this," Lena had said, her eyes filled with regret and sorrow. But some things, they can't be undone. It had taken every ounce of Holloway's resolve not to let her words break him. She had been as much a victim as Christopher, trapped in a cycle of manipulation and fear. And though she had cooperated with the investigation, the damage was done. Christopher was gone, and nothing could bring him back. The case was closed, the courtroom drama had ended, but the town's air of secrecy had not lifted. The damage to Ravenswood was done in a different way, a quiet erosion of trust that would linger long after Holloway and Larkin left. The town would carry its secrets, burying them deep beneath the surface, waiting for someone else to dig them up. Holloway had been wrong about one thing. Ravenswood hadn't been a town of forgotten stories, but one of stories buried beneath layers of lies. He had thought he was simply uncovering the truth about Christopher Parker's death. What he didn't anticipate was how the truth would ripple through every corner of the town, and how the consequences would be felt by everyone who had once turned a blind eye to the past. As Holloway walked toward his car, his thoughts heavy with the burden of the case, he glanced at the small patch of woods just beyond the courthouse, a place where he had once believed answers could be found. Now he knew better. "Sometimes, the answers are right in front of us," he murmured to himself. "We just have to be willing to see them." But in the end, Holloway realized it wasn't just about the answers. It was about how people lived with the consequences of their actions, how they hid their darkest truths and built new lives on the wreckage of old ones. Some truths were never meant to be revealed, and some stories were better left untold. As he got into the car, Larkin looked up from her phone. "You all right?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. Holloway didn't answer right away. He stared out the windshield, watching the people pass by, their lives seemingly untouched by the horrors they had uncovered. "Yeah," he finally said, his voice low, "but I don't think I'll ever look at this town the same way again." As they drove away from Ravenswood, the sound of tires on the road felt almost foreign to him. He didn't know if he was leaving behind the town or the ghosts of its past, but one thing was certain. Some stories never truly end. They linger in the air, echoing in the shadows, waiting for someone to stumble upon them. And the past, it seemed, would always have a way of finding its way to the surface.